Today we have the M-TAC, Medi-Cal Mobile Crisis Training and Technical Assistance Center, first training from the 4-part series for first episode Psychosis or FEP. Today we are empowering mobile crisis teams to recognize and to respond to people experiencing FEP. And this is session 1, Introduction to Psychosis and FEP. Most of you know me, but I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. I am Danielle Ragiv. I am a training and technical assistance specialist with the Center for Applied Research Solutions, and I work on the M-TAC project. Just a couple things to get through today. Just a quick disclaimer, this presentation was prepared for the Medi-Cal Mobile Crisis Training and Technical Assistance Center, which is funded by the Department of Healthcare Services and administered by the Center for Applied Research Solutions in collaboration with Advocates for Human Potential. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of DHCS, CARS, or AHP, or the M-TAC project. All material appearing in this presentation, except for copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from DHCS or the authors. Citation of the presentation is appreciated. Please do not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without specific written authorization from the M-TAC project. This presentation will be recorded today and available on the M-TAC website later. By using the chat box, you agree to keep your comments relevant to today's topic of event, and also that the chat box does not reflect the views or policies of the presenters, DHCS, or their affiliates or contractors. And again, anything happening in the chat box that does not align with our session today or that is disruptive, individuals will be used without warning. All right. And like I said earlier, today's series is the first session in the series. The series is FEP, Empowering Mobile Crisis Teams to Recognize and Respond to People Experiencing FEP. And we're really hoping to support mobile crisis teams who might experience working with individuals in crisis experiencing FEP out in the field in the community. And so one of the reasons why we worked very closely with our partners on this series and the trainings that follow is to support mobile crisis teams who encounter individuals experiencing psychosis in the field, because oftentimes we lack the knowledge and the expertise or skills to correctly assess the symptoms, deliver effective interventions, or make the appropriate referrals necessary for aftercare and follow-up. And this is not by it's not because of our own doing or our own fault. It's just we can't learn everything at once, right? It comes through experience and work and knowledge. And so, and oftentimes we meet folks out in the field who are in crisis and we just don't have the experience or enough knowledge or information to know what's happening. And the lack of psychosis-specific training can lead to the overuse of psychiatric holds, individuals being sent to emergency room for treatment, and law enforcement involvement. So we're really hoping to be able to decrease that with increasing awareness of what this looks like or what it could look like and what you can do to support and help in the best way possible. This training series will help mobile crisis teams recognize that individuals experiencing psychosis can be safely stabilized in the field, allowing them to remain in the community. So just because an individual experiences psychosis doesn't mean they have to be placed on hold. And that is, a big statement, but there's a lot that goes along with that, and we are going to touch on that. Not all crisis experiences are the same, and there may be times when individuals are not able to remain safely in the community, and we understand that. But the purpose of this training series is to support mobile crisis teams in effectively determining the most appropriate level of care after a brief intervention for individuals experiencing psychosis. And lastly, this training series will also equip mobile crisis teams with knowledge and resources to connect individuals experiencing psychosis to coordinated specialty care clinics, also known as CSC. CSC is an evidence-based intervention designed specifically for those experiencing FEP. And the importance of today's training, especially for mobile crisis teams, is that historically mobile crisis teams have limited or no training in psychosis. It's not something that we get often or enough. Mobile crisis team members may not be familiar with the common symptoms of psychosis, which can lead to the use of unnecessary holds, or like we said, sending folks to the emergency room for treatment, things like that. Today's training is foundational and intended to empower mobile crisis teams to understand psychosis as a spectrum of experiences. Today's trainings will also help mobile crisis teams understand that symptoms of psychosis can vary in impact relative to other mental health statuses, personal and environmental and cultural contexts, and access to basic needs. Just a brief look at the series that will happen over the next several months. So we have today's session, which is the Introduction to Psychosis and FEP. Training 2 will focus on FEP and mobile crisis assessment and intervention strategies and behaviors, and that is in February, or specifically February 25th. Training 3 is on follow-up check-ins, connecting to ongoing services and coordinated specialty care on March 18th. And on April 29th, training number 4, putting it all into practice. So really applying those FEP skills in the field. Each training is followed by a community of practice discussion as well. And so the COP that follows this training will happen this Thursday. And we will put that information in the chat for you as well. The COPs that follow are intended to offer additional time for peer learning and discussion and engagement with folks with lived experience as well. And so those are going to be very intentional discussions. Today's learning objectives for the session: identify biases, misunderstandings, and myths about psychosis. Review the importance of using certain person-centered strengths-based language when talking about people or to people experiencing psychosis. Discuss common symptoms of psychosis, review the prevalence of psychosis, and assess the range of impact of psychosis on daily life. Understand the spectrum of psychosis and differentiate relative impact of psychosis within the context of other experiences. And review biological, environmental, and social factors that can lead to the development of psychosis. And today we have EpiCal with us. They are a very big team full of experts and individuals with knowledge and lived experience. They supported the development of this series and training and have been great partners to work with. I'm going to now hand it off to Dr. Catherine Pierce, who will do a brief introduction and take over the training for you all. Dr. Pierce?
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. Very happy to be here with everyone this morning. My name is Dr. Katie Pierce. I have over 10 years of experience working with early psychosis. I have worked in a clinical positions before, both providing outpatient care to individuals with psychosis, as well as inpatient psychiatric care. Right now, most of my work is research-oriented, and I also act as EpiCal, or Early Psychosis Intervention California, as our training and technical assistance outreach team lead. So we're going to talk about a few different things today, and what I really want to come across in this training is that psychosis is viewed really differently from different cultures, from different perspectives, and reaction to psychosis for the individuals experiencing it, as well as for their loved ones. It's different for everyone. Today we'll hit on a few different key points. So how language that we use is really important in this space, what psychosis spectrum experiences can look like for many people, why psychosis develops, where does it come from, and then some of those key takeaways for the mobile crisis teams. Before I get into some of the content for today, I do really want to center also that it's really important to consider a whole individual when you're looking at their circumstances. And this is true outside the field of psychosis as well. So of course, every individual has their own thoughts, their own emotions about the things that they're going through. They each also have their own unique biology and genetics that may predispose them for risk for different things. But more so than just the individual is what is surrounding them and the culture they're surrounded by. And this could be everything from their family members, to what they're seeing on social media, to the school or workplace that they're in, to the structural components of the healthcare system that they're existing in. All of these different levels really interact with an individual and can impact the way that we move forward and make recommendations and even try to understand some of the experiences that they've been having. So before we get into it, I am curious to ask, and please feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. When you hear the word psychosis, what do you think of? What immediately comes to mind? Fear, potentially drug-induced, not living in reality, confusion, irrational thoughts, break in reality, seeing or hearing anything others can't, people thinking you can't make your own decisions, trouble thinking clearly, disorganization I'm seeing in the chat as well. Altered reality relative to respective societal agreed upon realities. Negative things, delusions. Different or changes in conversation, behavioral patterns, fear, anger, delusions, hallucinations, paranoia. Difficulty determining what's real or not. Absolutely. And as these responses are coming in, I really want to highlight too that a lot of the things that we're exposed to day to day or in popular media or social media often really focuses in on the negative aspects. And that's often what comes to mind first. So I'm hoping today we can talk a little bit more about what some of those experiences that folks have are, and start to get a little deeper of an understanding. I'm seeing also in the chat intersectionality with religious spiritual perceptions. There's a lot of good things. I wish I could read them all. Okay. So psychosis spectrum symptoms occur within many, many different diagnoses, and it's not uncommon for individuals to receive a whole host of different diagnoses from different medical or mental health professionals that they talk to. Psychosis diagnoses can include things like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, depression with psychotic features. However, they can also look really similar to other things. Psychosis can look really similar to things like different medical conditions, to things like autism spectrum disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. And it can be really tricky sometimes for individuals to parse apart which diagnosis might be the best fitting for an individual at a given point in time. I think one of the things that's important to remember is that diagnoses can and definitely do change over time, as either a person experiences things for longer and longer, or as symptoms or experiences change over time. And the important part to this is they're always changing, and they definitely do not define an individual. Biology and genetics. We got a lot of questions about where does psychosis come from? And it's important to note there is no one psychosis gene. We can't run a genetic test and look at a certain indicator and say that someone will or will not develop psychosis. We do know that for many people, there is a genetic component. So for individuals, for example, who have a parent's biological mom or dad or biological sibling, there's about a 10% rate. So if you have a biological mom with psychosis, that genetic risk is about 10% for you. For identical twins, it's about 50-50. It's important to note that genes that confer risk for psychosis can be passed down from generation to generation, but doesn't necessarily mean that other individuals in the same family have received formal psychosis diagnoses before. Another thing that we get asked a lot, besides where does this come from, is, well, is psychosis dangerous? You know, are individuals who have these experiences a risk to the individuals around them? And a lot of this comes from kind of that negative portrayal of social media, popular media, and just the history of disorder as well. But what I want to highlight is that in actuality, what the research shows is that individuals with psychosis are actually much more likely to be a victim of crime than to ever perpetrate one themselves. And individuals are much more likely than their peers to die by suicide. So there's actually a much greater risk to the individual who's experiencing psychosis. Language is important, especially when you are first meeting with someone and trying to establish a bond. Creating a shared language together is really important in making sure someone feels understood. The language that I'm going to use in this presentation is based on feedback from service users and family in the EpiCal program. Word preference, however, can really differ from person to person and culture to culture. And whenever possible, it's important to use the preferred language and terminology of the individual that's in front of you. Language changes all the time. There's a lot of things that I used to say 10 years ago that is not the preferred terminology anymore. So it's also important to remain really flexible in the language that we use. I have a couple of slides of examples of changes in language that we recommend. I'll highlight a few of these. If we have time at the end, we can certainly come back to more of them. First, you'll notice me using the word client or service user over the word patient. We've received feedback from individuals with lived experience on our team. The term patient is really medical and implies an illness and the need for treatment. I also want to highlight the second one here. There's a really common phrasing in early psychosis that's called a first break, right? When someone first has their first episode of psychosis. And instead of saying first break, the current preferred terminology is first episode, because people are not broken. So we typically will not use that phrasing any longer. Okay. The next slide, and what I want to highlight here is oftentimes a lot of the thoughts that we have about individuals and the potential reason behind their behaviors, it can be really culturally bound. So for example, what we hear sometimes from families is the thought or idea that someone's being manipulative or is pretending to be experiencing psychosis for some sort of like attention or to gain something. And what's really important here is to really approach with an open mind and to be curious about what the individual is experiencing. Okay. How does psychosis present? So psychosis looks really different for everyone. So it's hard. There is no one prototypical example I can provide of how psychosis always looks, but there are a lot of common experiences. When we talk about psychosis, there's three main groups of experiences. One is changes in your perception, thinking, and communication. Sometimes this is called positive symptoms. This is things like seeing and hearing things others cannot, different beliefs or thoughts that aren't shared by other individuals in your same community or family, communication or speech that's hard to follow. The next group is changes in expression and motivation, and this is sometimes called negative symptoms if you've heard that terminology. So that's a change in motivation for daily activities and decreased body expressiveness. And I'll go into both of these in a little more detail later on. Third and finally, we have cognitive changes. So individuals often will start experiencing changes in their ability to really pay attention to things. It might be a lot harder than before, and more difficulty with memory and kind of understanding and interpreting and encoding new information. Okay. So one of the things that I want to call out about these changes in perception, thinking, and communication is, although I just went over 3 really common experiences that individuals with psychosis have, these ones are the only ones that are required for a formal psychosis diagnosis to be made. So those are those things where any alteration to your 5 senses, seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting things that other people do not notice. Or often what we hear is someone will have a sense or a feeling of a presence that other people can't see that's near them or behind them. Changes in thoughts or beliefs that aren't shared by others in your community or your family. And this is really a key point because there's a lot of different beliefs depending on just the culture that you're steeped in. And so this really differs family to family. Okay. Changes in expression and motivation. This can look like a lot of things. Things that individuals may notice or their loved ones may notice are an individual might be not talking as much or more slowly than usual, have fewer facial expressions or bodily gestures than typical, have a real decrease in ability to enjoy the things that they usually do, and then also a drop from what's usual for that individual, usually a drop in how much social activity or how much work or school or different things you want to be involved in, that decrease in motivation. Okay. Changes in cognition. So it can become really difficult for individual to follow conversations. It can be hard to focus on tasks. It can be really hard to recall information that you just learned and think through different components of the problem. And especially when emotions are intense, it can get really hard to kind of control or regulate emotions the way that you typically do, or regulate behavior the way you typically do when emotions are lower. You can also have difficulty identifying how others are feeling. So what all of these things look like in practice, for example, as an individual who's in crisis, who might be experiencing a lot of these different experiences, might have a hard time following a conversation, could really benefit from things like slow speech, repetition, smaller chunks that are easier to remember. And in the social cognition box down at the bottom right, another thing I want to highlight is there is a fair amount of research that it becomes difficult sometimes for individuals to interpret facial expressions. So what you might feel like is a very neutral facial expression might appear threatening to other individuals. So it can be really helpful to give verbal encouragement or verbal cues that you're there for them and you're listening to what they're saying. Psychosis is very, very common. This is really surprising to a lot of folks that I talk with, but we really view psychosis as a spectrum, and I'll talk more about that later. But up to 37% of people have mild psychosis spectrum experiences. A common example I really like to give is how many people have ever thought you felt or heard your cell phone vibrate or ring when it did not. Maybe you're expecting an important call or text and you keep thinking it goes off, but it hasn't. That's a really good example of something where there is no stimuli, but it's something that you experienced and falls on that psychosis spectrum. Now, you might not be able to remember the last time that happened if you think back to it. So examples of kind of working up the spectrum might be, for example, if you start hearing your phone go off very often when no one is there, you might start thinking there's something wrong with your cell phone, or maybe someone's trying to communicate with you. You might contact your cell provider or carrier. And you might become more distressed the more often that that happens. And that starts to tip further up the psychosis spectrum. But if you look at your phone, get on with your day, it's a very culturally normative experience. Another 3% of people will be diagnosed with psychosis. It's the general incidence rate for schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder in the general population. And then many more will also be diagnosed with high risk for psychosis. Okay. Impacts on daily life. You might notice a lot of changes that are pretty non-specific, or these are things that you could also hear from family members. You might hear things like, someone's not dressing or bathing or eating as much as they usually do. Could have changes in their sleep pattern. They suddenly stopped engaging in their hobbies or activities that they typically really enjoy. They're suddenly struggling a lot more at work or school. So, for example, they were getting like solid B average before in college, but now they're starting to struggle in classes that they used to find pretty easy. So you might start noticing some of those non-specific changes. One of the things I also want to highlight is just the importance of identifying psychosis early for a number of different reasons. One is so that we can help support people to get them back to what matters to them most, whatever that might be, whether that's to their families, whether that's to their hobbies, to school, whatever it is for that individual. The earlier that we identify folks who are experiencing first episode psychosis, the more effective our interventions are as well. So typically responses to psychotherapy, to medication, and other supports actually work much better the earlier you catch this. And it's problematic because in the United States, it can take about 18 and a half months to identify someone with psychosis. So we have a lot of folks out in the community experiencing first episode psychosis who haven't had the opportunity to get matched supports yet. We're really hoping that early screening and the emergence of so many more early specialty clinics can really help reduce this number. Okay. The following slides that I'm going to go over were developed by the EpiCal work group to introduce FEP. So these were really a collaboration between the outreach team of our technical training and technical assistance program and our lived experience integration team. So these slides were created in conjunction of those two groups with feedback from our diversity, equity, and inclusion team as well. So first, these experiences exist on a spectrum. We have over on the left-hand side in the lighter area, what we would call less impactful experiences. And then on the darker side, over on the right, more impactful experiences. And when we're talking about, well, how much does a given experience have on a person? How do we figure that out? There's some questions that we like to ask. So do the experiences you're having, do they get in the way of any of the things that you like to do or want to do? Do these experiences cause worry, concern, or distress for you? And do these experiences impact what matters? When discussing impact, it's really important to look at how these experiences impact the entire individual. So we don't want to just look at one area of life. We really want to try to get a snapshot of all the things that the person's experiencing. Okay, so existing on this impactful to more impactful to less impactful spectrum, we have balloons. Both big balloons and small balloons can be impactful. Small balloons are things that are less distressing, so they don't bother you too much. Whereas big balloons, those are difficult to ignore, and those are really distressing. Both the impact and the amount of distress should be defined by the individual who's having these experiences. And I'll go through several examples of what the spectrum can look like. Okay. So for the vast majority of folks, for 70 to 90% of individuals, the first experience they have, the first balloon, is smaller and falls right in that mild or attenuated range, right? It doesn't impact them too much. So you might hear things like, I'm seeing a shadowy figure. This happens twice a week. It lasts 1 to 10 seconds. I think it's kind of weird, but it's not really scary because I just do a double take and then suddenly it's not there anymore. And this doesn't really impact my daily life with my friends or my homework. Like it happens, it's odd, but then I kind of forget about it. So that's an example of not a small balloon, less distressing, less impactful experience. A lot of individuals have these small balloons and these more mild experiences and never go on to experience large or really impactful experiences. So for the remaining about 10 to 30% of individuals, sometimes that first balloon that you have is larger and more impactful. So for example, you might hear things like, there's an unknown force that's watching me and I can't see it, but I think it's planning to hurt me. And this could happen on and off every day. You could be really distressed, really worried for your own safety, so worried, in fact, that it is really tough to pay attention and focus at work because you feel like you always have to look over your shoulder. Sometimes little balloons are highly impactful. So sometimes an individual might not feel very distressed, but the experience might still have a lot of impact on their day-to-day life. So for example, you might have someone say that they believe they're the next coming of Christ and they're going to save the world. They don't feel any distress about this. In fact, they could feel really lucky that they were chosen to be able to help save so many people. They could start using all their time to really research how to fulfill this purpose. And maybe they've stopped talking to their friends and stopped talking to their family or going to work because they're so focused on this new goal. So low distress, but really high impact. However, sometimes a lot of balloons can be present at the same time. You can have someone who's having several different experiences that may or may not be tied to one another. So for example, you might hear your name being called. This has been happening all week. You're like, gosh, maybe I'm just tired. No one else can hear it. When I asked, my friend if she heard someone call for me too, she said no. It's kind of strange. You could also be having at other times, sometimes seeing a shadowy figure when you walk to school. And you might know that that's not real, but change your route sometimes just in case it's something that's following you. And then over here on the more impactful side, you might be really worried that your friends are starting to plot against you or might want to hurt you somehow. This feeling could be present a lot of the day, nearly every day. It could be really impacting the number of friends you have. And you could be really starting to miss those friendships because it doesn't feel safe to be around folks. And what I want to highlight about this slide is when you have a lot of things happening at the same time, it's really important to ask the individual having these experiences what it is that is important to them, that they think is getting in the way, that they want to focus on. For example, if you were seeing someone and you would want to say, which of these is really getting in the way? And if it's, I'm concerned about losing my friendships, let's focus there, right? I don't want to pick focusing just on hearing your name being called because I'm most concerned about that. It's really something that's guided by the individual. Okay, So we sometimes have things that aren't really related that co-occur, but sometimes we have a lot of psychosis spectrum experiences grouped together that are tied together. So how can this look? For example, you might have a voice telling you that others are trying to poison you. Happens almost every day. It's really distressing, and it's difficult to tell if that voice is trustworthy or not. Sometimes you see a figure, and it seems like that voice sometimes could be coming from that figure. And then you could also be experiencing paranoia, suspiciousness, really worrying that other people are trying to poison you, right? I'm hearing this voice that's telling me this might happen, and I'm really worried that this might be happening, to the point that perhaps you're losing weight because you're afraid to eat food because it might be poisoned. Co-occurring balloons can also be at different levels of impact. So for example, you might have situations where you have things that are happening that are tied together and others that are not. This could look like, on the one hand, in that less impactful, less distressing range, maybe you see a shadowy figure at the foot of your bed at night. It only happens once or twice a month. It lasts about a minute, and it is a little scary. It's a little off-putting, but you can ultimately ignore it and fall asleep. On the other hand, you might also be having other experiences that are more distressing and impactful. You could be hearing creaking in the vents at night. You're sure that someone's listening in on you. It can bother you a lot, happens multiple times a week. And you kind of lay in bed at night and stay up and listen to this. It makes it really hard to sleep. You might also sometimes think that you see movement in the walls at night. It might not happen as often as the creaking that you hear, but sometimes you do get up in the night and check the walls just in case, and this can make it really hard to go back to sleep. A psychosis does not exist, however, in a vacuum. Sometimes what we see happen is someone might say that they're experiencing psychosis, and that's all someone focuses on. And what we really want to encourage is backing up from that to see the whole person a little more broadly. So psychosis can be one experience of many things that are going on in an individual's life. So they might say, yes, I'm experiencing psychosis, but I'm really worried about my housing. I've been fighting a lot with my family. I'm trying to manage a medical condition, as well as a PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis at the same time. There can be a lot of things going on. Sometimes psychosis is at the forefront. Sometimes that is the thing that is the most distressing and impactful. And an individual might say, yes, let's focus on this. But sometimes there's other things that really need to be addressed first that are more urgent. And it's really important to ask service users to guide goals based on what's important to them and most central to them right now. There's a lot of things to consider when it comes to psychosis. And one of those things is developmental norms. So for example, when you're talking to individuals, some things are more common in younger children, like imaginary friends, for example, and less common in older individuals. There's also a lot of differences in cultural or familial contexts. For example, you might have cultural beliefs or religious beliefs that are shared by your family. So for example, I'm thinking of a family, and maybe the family identifies as Catholic, and an individual might say, I hear the voice of God talking to me. And how can we tell, is this part of a religious experience, or is this potentially more on the psychosis spectrum? It's really important to talk to the individual and the other individuals in their family or religious community about their experience. to see if what the person's experiencing significantly differs from their community in some way. So, for example, the family might say something like, we talk to God, but none of us hear him talking out loud back to us, but this individual is here experiencing that. So it could differ in some key way. It's also important to think about environmental factors and trauma. So, for example, if someone is feeling unsafe or suspicious of individuals around them, do they live in an unsafe neighborhood? Does that suspiciousness actually help keep them safe day to day? Are they being bullied in school? Is there something going on that's contributing to this? And then substance use. So for individuals who experience psychosis symptoms in the context of substances, for some individuals, if you stop using that substance, then the psychosis also subsides. However, for other individuals, if you experience things like hallucinations or psychosis experiences like that during substance use, you're actually, even after you stop use, at a much higher risk of converting to psychosis later on, even independently without substance use in the future. Some example of some of those cultural changes. So first, I'm seeing ghosts. So you might have an individual, this individual on the left over here, and he sees ghosts. He's really glad he has this experience. His mom sees ghosts. His great grandma could see ghosts too. He sees them 2 or 3 times a week, and he knows that ghosts are real. And he's glad he has this experience because he can really relate to his family members about it. It doesn't cause any distress. It doesn't impact his day to day or the things that are important to him. So that's a good example of someone who's having an experience that fits really well into their culture. Then you might have someone on the right, and technically it's the same experience, right? She's also seeing ghosts, so the same thing, but she's not from that same culture, and her response is very different. No one else can see them. This is happening several times a week. This about the same frequency as the gentleman. But she's so afraid that she can't sleep sometimes, and she's very certain they're real, and it's very distressing to her. So an example of similar experience, but seen through a very different lens based on the culture that you're from. Developmental contexts, imaginary friends, or friends that others cannot see. For a younger kid, so someone who's 10, for example, or 7 to 10, they might be really glad to have imaginary friends. They play with them only when they want to. They see these friends as real and play with them a few times a week. And this might be really normative for someone who's younger. But then let's say that you have someone who's 24 who has friends that others cannot see. You could also be very certain that they're real and talk to them. But maybe this is a case where you're starting to talk to those friends that others can't see more than your friends that you had before. And it's hard to make them go away when you want them to. So they tend to stick around, and you don't have control over it. So that would be an example of someone who, again, it's technically the same experience, but the way that we view it is very different just based on the stage of development that the individual is in.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. So much for that. That was, there's a lot happening in the chat, and I want to second that the The slides, the balloon slides that illustrate the impact of different symptoms and how people experience those symptoms are absolutely brilliant. I just wanted to give a moment to acknowledge that those slides were developed by the EpiCal team in collaboration with stakeholders, people with lived experience over a very long time. So they were very intentional, and a lot of thought and a meaningful work went into them. So thank you for everyone, expressing gratitude and appreciation for those slides in that section, because that team put in a lot of work. So thank you, Dr. Pierce. As you all heard from Dr. Pierce from the EpiCal team around first episode psychosis and what that might look like, and why it's important to really have a solid understanding of what it can look like in the field and working with individuals in crisis, we wanted to offer time to just kind of reflect back on why this training is so important for those of you in the room who are mobile crisis team members, who work for a county mobile crisis team or other crisis response teams. And so we wanted to just kind of take a moment to do that. And just a couple of things that we learned in this session today from the EpiCal team is that psychosis looks different for everyone. It's extremely unique, and there is no universal presentation. And the way individuals experience and relate to their symptoms and what they're experiencing in the moment can be different too, as illustrated by the balloon slides, right? Especially the last two with the developmental and cultural context brought in. Language is huge. It's key. We want to avoid confrontation. When we speak to someone, we want to use a calm and reassuring tone, and use simple language and focus on validating feelings and validating the context of their delusions and experiences. Active listening is key. Pay close attention to what the person is saying and try to identify activations that may be contributing to their distress. Show up with the lens of trying to understand their experience and what is happening to them. Have empathy and a non-judgmental approach. Try to understand the person's perspective and avoid dismissing their experience and what it means to them. View the person holistically and consider any natural supports that can help in keeping the person safe without using restrictive interventions when it is not necessary. This is just a gentle reminder that there are so many complexities when it comes to supporting an individual experiencing psychosis through mobile crisis response. One, it may be the first time you've ever experienced working with anyone experiencing psychosis, so that you might drum up your own feelings and reactions. And so there's no one universal approach when working with an individual in crisis, and especially when working with an individual in crisis who's experiencing psychosis. Adapting to the person's experience and what they need in the moment is crucial. Listening to understand their current state will support how you engage with them and what supports are needed. And reminders that how families and communities respond to psychosis may look different for everyone, depending on their role and experiences. Individuals in psychosis may want different levels of engagement in care. Their voice is important. Different perspectives can impact the information that is shared and or what is seen as a crisis. And support persons, their level of engagement in care is determined by multiple factors. So whether we involve individuals, who support the person in crisis in the engagement of making decisions in care can depend on many different things. I want to also give Dr. Pierce an opportunity to chime in if there's anything you'd like to add to this.
Yeah, I think that is really, really well said. And I also kind of want to echo, I know some of the experiences that folks have had with adult children, it can be really tough for families who really want to be involved, who in the moment, their adult loved one who's experiencing psychosis may not want them involved. And wanted to put that out as one of the tricky things that we can run into as well. I know that in later sessions, we'll talk more about coordinated specialty care and interventions for early psychosis. But we really do like to encourage whenever possible for someone to have a support, whether it's friend or family or chosen family, to really help support them through the recovery process.
Thank you. Like we've said over and over again, psychosis is unique for everyone, and so is their recovery. It's important to adjust care based on the need of that individual person. Having a comprehensive assessment is the most important first step. So making sure that you're comprehensive in how you're asking questions and how you're working with that person or their family or caregivers or natural supports that are there is huge. Common treatments, interventions may include the following. So these are some things that might happen as a result of engaging with the mobile crisis team during their first episode or an episode. So we have therapy, so traditional therapy, and also integrating their families or their caregivers or their supports into therapy, medication management, substance use management, supported education and employment, cognitive remediation, skills training, and peer and family support. These are all very important to determine and discuss also in the assessment phase. So when you're out there working with an individual in crisis who might be experiencing psychosis, or it could be their first episode, having these discussions about different treatment interventions through those follow-up check-ins and that follow-up care that's provided once they receive mobile crisis service is important and key in getting them to the right next place and next step for their recovery and treatment. Anything you want to add here, Dr. Pierce?
The only thing I would add is I know our diversity team also on this slide likes to mention that some individuals have alternative things they would like to do, alternatives outside of coordinated specialty care. And so really being open to working in outside perspectives. I'm thinking of one example. I hope it's a good one. There's a family who really wanted to take a lot of different herbal supplements and things like that at home that were very culturally important to them. And a psychiatrist from the team went over all of the ingredients of all of the things to make sure that nothing would interact with any medications, for example. So really making sure to ask about and then integrate some of those other practices where you can.
Great points. Thank you so much. And just a few strategies as we get closer to wrapping up today's session for all of you in the room that are mobile crisis teams, or even if you're not on a mobile crisis team and you've interacted with a mobile crisis team as someone receiving the service. These are just some strategies that also came from the training and just gentle reminders that make sure you're in a safe and private space for confidentiality. There may be times when it's difficult to do this, to find a private space. But do your best to keep private and confidential information like PHI or private health information safe. When asking about PHI in an open public space, it's important to prioritize confidentiality as best as possible, and also for the person to feel like that this is a priority. Protecting their information is huge. Be respectful if someone is not in a space or ready to talk about aspects of their experiences or their current situation. Just be respectful of where they're at and what they're willing to share and not share. Use language that helps you understand where they're coming from, what their experience and perspective has been, and asking them what's been happening for you versus the old, what's wrong with you. Listen and validate their feelings. Focus on the individual's goals and, helping them feel safe and whatever their preferences are. Consider how we keep them safe without taking away their rights. And this goes back to something we'll expand on in the series is how do we work with individuals experiencing psychosis to help keep them safe, to remain safely in the community. Just because they're experiencing psychosis doesn't mean they automatically meet criteria or need for a higher level of care or hospitalization. The goal is getting people back to what matters to them. So it's not just about controlling symptoms that is typically done with medications. It's a focus on wellness as defined by how they receive those services and which services they receive that are most appropriate for them, and encouraging involvement of support persons in recovery. So having support systems, caregivers, friends, family throughout their recovery is huge and important. So that helps get them back to where to where they want to be and what matters most to them. And I'll also ask Dr. Pierce if she'd like to chime in.
Yeah, I'm going to keep saying well said because it's always well said. Yeah, and I think this too is another place to highlight where sometimes an individual's goals and their support person's goals can be different, and that can also be challenging. I think here it's really important to focus on alignment. So being aligned to, we want to get to like this is a good place we want to get to, versus necessarily agreeing on the prescribed steps on how to get to your eventual goal. So really focusing on aligning the individual and their supports as well.
Thank you. Just a few points here in terms of what we're going to start to explore in the next training. As we wrap up today's session, we just really wanted to go over some of these things so that you know what's coming next. We really want to be able to expand on the multiple levels of severity in psychosis. So having an episode or experiencing psychosis does not automatically warrant an individual being placed on a hold or mean that they need a higher level of care. So we're really going to explore that and dive a little deeper into that. We're going to explore how community-based interventions that focus on listening to understand their current situation or experience could be the safest, most effective intervention. That is the intervention. We're going to learn about collaboration and how leaning in on the individual and or their family's strengths could support keeping the person in crisis in their community, as well as explore how individuals in crisis who are experiencing psychosis can remain safely in their community while facilitating voice and choice, which is a person-centered approach. And that is what this whole service is about, right? A person-centered approach. And lastly, as again, we've said over and over, is that everyone's experience is unique, whether they're experiencing psychosis or not. All of our experiences are unique. And the most important thing to do when someone is in crisis is to listen. And as we wrap up today's session, we wanted to share that with you all. And I want to give a huge thank you to the EpiCal team for their partnership on this series and training today. And we want to thank you all in the room for the valuable life-saving work you do out in the community. You all matter and you all make a difference in the lives that you touch every single day. So thank you. And just a gentle reminder, listening in mobile crisis response is key. Listen to understand and support that person with whatever is happening to them in the moment. Listening is the intervention. And I will hand it back to Dr. Pierce.
Thank you. I also did want to open the floor up for questions as well with the remaining time that we have.
First question we got was from Christina Dorn. What screening tools are currently being used?
So the one that we use in EpiCal, it's called the Prodromal Questionnaire Brief, the PQB. This really works best as a broad screening. So, for example, we recommend that if you can get a clinic to implement this broad screening along with all their other anxiety, depression screeners at the same time, we really recommend it. It's 21 items and asks about experiences that people have and then rates, are those experiences things that distress you? And that's really where the ratings come from. That can be really helpful for identifying high risk for psychosis or first episode psychosis. However, if you have someone in front of you, you respond to a crisis call and they're experiencing these things, I would not hand them a screener in that kind of situation. So I think it partly depends what screener depends on what the setting is as well.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question, I believe, is what are the steps for those experiencing psychosis and homelessness? Do they get referred to an inpatient program?
You may have to lean on some individuals for this. I know this looks very different depending on where you live and the resources in your community.
That's very true. I think um, that's also dependent on what's happening. Just because someone is experiencing psychosis and homelessness doesn't mean they need an inpatient program. And so that is something that needs proper assessment, proper understanding of what is happening in those moments, and are they safe to remain in the community. Homelessness might be a choice for them. There are some people who experience psychosis and people who don't experience psychosis, and they have family and options to go live with others, but they're choosing their current state for whatever reasons. And it's our job to understand that and to honor their choice. And so we wouldn't automatically refer them to an inpatient program if that wasn't absolutely necessary.
I can comment on that as well.
Yeah.
I should say, based on my experience, that's very true. And that's something that's probably the more difficult thing for like family members to accept, is that, just because they're homeless or just because they're having a psychotic episode doesn't automatically mean that they meet the criteria to go into an inpatient unit. I would say that one of the biggest struggles is helping the family understand that's the case. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah. And I think even when you have someone in crisis who's not experiencing psychosis, and you have these situations where the family, you've determined as the responder that this person doesn't necessarily need a higher level of care. They're not an immediate risk. There's no safety concern, but the family is arguing against that, right? Like, no, they need to go. They can't stay here. And that becomes tricky in how to navigate those situations and those conversations. I don't know if Katy Perry, Katie Hayden Lewis, if you want to add anything to that. Or even Bonnie. I think Bonnie's here as well from the EpiCal team.
Yeah, I think, pardon me. Good morning, everyone. I think that in my experience, I think going back just a little bit with the question is that my experience is many people won't endorse that they're experiencing psychosis. So starting and that a lot of rapport and trust, which mobile crisis teams are often good at doing, is the aim. In my experience, many times there could be multiple interactions as trust is built. And that through those interactions, sorting out what are the most pressing needs, what is the person willing and able to do, what resources are available, kind of unfolds. In a situation where somebody is no longer able to live in their current house and in the process of becoming houseless, I would say the same, and slowing the plan down so that it's pretty step by step. And pretty matching the most immediate needs. So is there respite? Is there a conversation that could happen that could allow the person to stay housed for another half a day or a day? And that's been really useful. And I know there are different groups of houseless people and different statuses. So those are some thoughts about what the approach might look like. I think starting with the endorsement of psychosis is a little tricky. Some of what Dr. Pierce already described, and more going with a person's language, and then supporting the family's choice or supporter's choice who might be providing housing in those situations around what their needs are going to be, and figuring out what those boundaries are, and going very step by step. Nice and easy to see what's possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I really appreciate what Katie just shared. I've seen this a lot with families when a loved one is in crisis, where you hear, my son, my daughter can't be in this house, and I think it was said earlier in the presentation, I actually noted it down, that it's really important to look for something that could be accepted as a step forward. And this is what Katie was getting to, the step-by-step process. And I think in the process of the mobile crisis team's intervention, hopefully there's some de-escalation, and there is some small step that can be identified that makes it okay to kind of keep moving forward together as a family. Where that ends up, you don't know in that moment, but agreeing on some small progressive step, I think is really a good goal to have. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Bonita. And that is huge. I think even when, there might be back and forth between where this person should go or can go, it's helpful to problem solve with them directly, right? And come up with different ideas and places. There might be a good friend that's available for the night for some respite for everybody, right? Let's all take a break, even though this person can remain safely in the home because they're not an immediate risk to anyone or themselves. Can they go to the friend's house for the evening for everyone to just take a break? So different ways, different alternative ideas to bring up as a team when you're out there in the field. Next question. So best practices for helping someone differentiate from reality from psychosis. And so there's two questions here. Do you want me that's the first one, and then I'll go to the second one after that.
Yeah, so this is tricky. And the answer, like most of my answers, if you get to know me, is it depends. So if an individual is a little unsure whether something is real or not, sometimes you can do a little bit of reality testing. Sometimes you can have a really trusted individual help through that. However, if someone is experiencing, for example, a delusion where they believe that something is real and it is real to them, but you do not share that same belief, let's say they're 100% sure that someone in the government has come to kill them. With something like that, it's really important not to argue with that delusion, not to argue against someone's reality, and to really focus on the underlying thing that you're trying to work toward together. So in this moment, is their main concern, I don't think I'm safe. Okay, let's not focus on trying to convince you that this thing you're experiencing isn't real. Let's focus on what can we do to make sure that you are safe and take those steps. So really not pushing or fighting against that. You won't get too far.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. This other question is first psychotic episode, earliest age, onset, and symptoms, differentiating these from depressive with psychotic features, developmental cognitive delays. That's a big question.
Yes, that is a big question. So at EpiCal, we have some resources. I believe on YouTube, actually, Dr. Kalima Bolden-Thompson, who's on our team, has a presentation on neurodevelopmental considerations in psychosis. So I want to shout that out as a resource. If Katie Perry can think of any other ones that we have, that's good too. But yeah, that can definitely be tricky to parse apart. And you're right. So those changes in expression and motivation that I was talking about toward the beginning of the presentation, they look a lot like depression, right? Where you have a lot of those same drops in, not doing as many activities as you enjoy as you typically do. And so that can be pretty tricky to parse apart. And I think it really comes to supporting the person with what they're going through at that moment. It's good to have that, like, is it psychosis in your mind, but really focusing on what's going on for that person in front of you.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to say something about the last question and Katie's response, which I think is so important for families. I know from my own personal experience with my daughter, who started experiencing psychosis between the age of 13 and 14, not having available specialty care to really assess her appropriately led to a delay of almost 2 years in her receiving treatment. And so I know in this training series, we'll be talking more about resources and linking people to resources. But for families, I think it's especially important to know what's available in their area and to get an understanding of these developmental and age-related factors, because we don't understand this either as families who are not medical providers, and certainly don't understand the ins and outs of diagnosing psychosis. And so I'm really glad that the M-TAC team is going to be addressing that in a later session.
I'm realizing, thank you so much for jumping in, Bonnie. I really appreciate it. And the other Katies. I think we have 3 EpiCal Katies today. I'm realizing that question was multi-part and I only answered part of it. I think the part of it was about the age of onset. So this can happen pretty young. On average, for individuals assigned male at birth, it tends to be around age 18 for first episode. And for assigned female at birth, it tends to be early to mid-20s, so a few years later. There's a few guesses about potential protective effects of estrogen on these differences. However, it can certainly happen in younger children as well. One of the things that you might bump into is that a lot of the coordinated specialty care programs, I think almost all of them, have some age limits for individuals that they are able to see. And we're trying to advocate for those to widen a bit. But a lot of the CSC programs only go down to age 12 right now.
Thank you. And I know we didn't talk a lot about CSC today, too much, but we will spend more time on that in the following trainings as well, especially when it comes to coordinating care and things like that. Is there an actual documented rate of co-occurrence on psychosis with high creativity vocations?
Oh, with high creativity. I'm not sure off the top of my head. I'd have to go take a peek at the literature.
Thank you. All right. And then another question just came in the chat. Do you have any information or insight regarding psychosis as it relates to the menstrual cycle?
Yeah, this might be one that I lean on others a bit for more as well. So I can speak to some of the things that I do know. So one of the things for individuals with uteruses is that there does seem to be some interplay and heightened risk at different phases for individuals with uteruses. So I'm not sure about the monthly menstrual cycle. I'd have to check into that as well. But for women especially, it's very common to also be at higher risk when you go through the postpartum period, so postpartum psychosis. And then there's another little blip of increased risk post-menopause for women as well. And I will say that for older individuals experiencing psychosis for the first time, it's really important to get a good history and to rule out, of course, any medical things that might be going on that can cause a lot of psychosis spectrum symptoms. I used to work with older adults in an inpatient setting, and one of the common things we would run into is that older women would come in presenting with psychosis for the first time, actually due to a UTI, a urinary tract infection. And oftentimes after treatment with antibiotics, all of the psychosis symptoms would decrease or go away. I'm not saying it's always a UTI. I'm just saying that when it is a later onset, it's good to have a couple of ideas of things to rule out going on in your mind as well.
Thank you for that. That's huge. That's so important, especially I think a lot of what we see too is older individuals, like you said, who are experiencing psychosis symptoms, but then are also experiencing symptoms of dementia or Alzheimer's, things like that. Can an acute episode of stress cause a psychosis reaction?
Yes. So, we do know that different stressors can interact with your unique biology and genetics. So this can show up in a lot of different ways. It's called the stress diathesis stress model. So if you have a predisposition for psychosis, so let's say that you have a few folks in your family who've experienced it and you have a slightly higher genetic risk. Based on that model, it is possible for things that you go through, so really high stress or even the stress of using a substance, for example, so emotional stress, that physical stress, tipping someone over into experiencing psychosis. So it certainly can be linked with those really, really highly stressful periods of life. It's important to note that psychosis, the course of it and how it develops or doesn't develop, is also really different person to person. So just because you experience psychosis spectrum symptoms doesn't necessarily mean you'll be experiencing those in the same way for the rest of your life. Some individuals experience them in blips and they'll go for long periods without experiencing them again, whereas others will have kind of a higher level over the course of psychosis. So it can look pretty different for people. Typically in clinical settings, so someone's doing CBT for psychosis, I'm sure that'll be talked about in the CSC portion, but typically we do talk to individuals about stressors and how to manage those things. If stress is something that the individual identifies as something that worsens or makes their experiences more distressing or more intense. So it's really important to talk to each individual person about what is it that helps or hurts for you and how can we support you in managing those things that we know are risks for increases in distress or impact.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have one more so far. Any tips or best practices on how to balance the spiritual and cultural perspective while also addressing the clinical side or alleviating symptoms or the balloons, and how to honor both sides? Great question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think here just being open and curious and like, can you tell me more about your beliefs? Like really holding that and trying to understand an individual and where they're coming from, I would say, because there's so many different sets of beliefs that different people have. It's definitely impossible to be an expert in everyone's beliefs. It's not realistic. So it is important to say, to ask about them and to take those, very seriously.
Yeah, I think in the context of a crisis, it might be useful when you're talking with people to understand what's unusual for the family and the person having the experiences and what's also usual. So if I'm not sharing, I would assume I'm not sharing anyone's culture unless we sort of sort that out and that gets clear. So getting curious is what's unusual, what's most distressing. That might help with the cultural piece and again, in the context of crisis, as well as resources. Who would you typically go to get support in this situation? Is there somebody that, we want to reach out to, like an imam or a pastor in this moment, even, that could be useful to the family and or the individual? I think as well, considering that really, as Dr. Pierce mentioned, and Bonnie mentioned, the language, so listening for the words being used to describe the experience will support centering the person's spirituality and culture, and moving away from prompts or inadvertently coercing people to agree or validate clinical language, skill language, because that's, I think, where things get really complicated really fast. So there's no evidence that anyone endorsing any therapeutic or clinical language or diagnostic language helps anyone feel better or less stress. It's actually a common source of conflict within families and groups during this time. So really, I think practicing using language that people are using and asking questions about who may join the situation or be contacted to be an additional support that's culturally, and I would use the word spiritually, supportive to the family. So saying those things, those words, particularly spirituality, has often been omitted in mental health interactions. And there's a lot of research that says that's not useful. It's actually very counterproductive to helping people make their way through. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'd add too that this is a great way to involve the family in the crisis intervention, to get an idea of what is more normal for the family in their culture, their religion. And, many families with different beliefs from, us as individuals might fear being misunderstood, misinterpreted, not respected. So engaging the family to be involved with sharing some of these cultural or religious or spiritual beliefs, I think, is a way to engage them, maybe de-escalate a situation, build more of a trust relationship in the moment. And so instead of avoiding that, I think that it could be an opening to a better experience.
Thank you all so much. Those incredible, incredible points. And I think, as crisis responders, sometimes we are the first people that, individuals might even work with or experience in the behavioral health world. And the one thing we don't want to do is cause harm or, escalate anything or make them not want to return to care when needed. So huge points. Thank you. We have 1 minute left. I want to thank the entire EpiCal team for today. This is amazing. And all of you here participating and giving your time. Thank you for being here and thank you for the work you do.